Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. I remember being in Capernaum when I went to Israel a little over 20 years ago. Capernaum is a fishing village on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and we walked among the houses there. I remember we visited the ruins of a synagogue, and they have excavated a foundation of this synagogue that was there at the time of Jesus. So it is likely that it was in that place that Jesus cast the demon out of the man in yesterday's story. But the highlight of the visit to Capernaum was Peter's house. Some very old traditions indicate that a particular house in Capernaum was Peter's house, and that's where the next story takes place as we continue making our way through one day in the life of Jesus. It's a simple story, really. Jesus and his followers leave the synagogue after Jesus had been teaching and then cast the demon out of the man there, and then they went to Peter's house. And then there's an interesting little detail that I misinterpreted for years. The Bible says, "Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told Jesus about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them." Now, I have to say that this has become one of my favorite stories in the Gospels, although, as I said, for years I misunderstood what it was about. You see, the way I read it was that Jesus and the guys left church and headed home for the Sabbath dinner, not too unlike what we might do following church services today. But when they got there, Peter's mother-in-law was sick, and so there wasn't any dinner. Jesus healed her, and she got up and fixed it for them. That's the way I read that. That's wrong. I think it's fair to note a couple of things we might not have thought about. First, if Peter had a mother-in-law, that means that Peter was, or had been, married at one time, although the Bible never mentions his wife's name. With a smile, we refer to her as Mrs. Peter. Second, preparing and serving the meal would have been the traditional role for a woman in that day, so my mistaken understanding of that story makes a little sense. What didn't make sense to me and always sat a little uncomfortably with me was that if Jesus healed her in order that she be able to prepare a meal for them, well, that just seems so un-Jesus-like. It seems like Jesus was using his godly power for his own ends, and that's just not quite what I expect out of Jesus. Jesus doesn't do things to help himself, and rather everything Jesus does reaches deeper. It's always about God or the compassion of God to help someone else. So healing her so Jesus and his friends could have a meal just can't be what that story is about. There has to be something more. Well, I don't know at what point I saw this story differently, but when I did, as I said, it became one of my favorites. You see, I don't think anymore that the story is about Jesus needing a meal. I don't even really think it's much about the healing, except for what happens as a result of the healing. The Bible tells us she began to serve them. You see, I think the point is this. When God acts in our lives, we are called on to respond. When God has compassion on us, we are called to have compassion for others. When God acts in our lives, we can't just pass it off and blithely sit on our hands. No. No, we must respond. And this woman is the model for us of just what we should do. When God acts in our lives, we should take the love we receive and return it by serving and caring for others. That's what Peter's mother-in-law did. God acted in her life, and she just had to respond. Now, we are going through one day in the life of Jesus, and note, he's already gone to synagogue, taught, amazed people, amazed them even more with casting a demon out of a man, cured a fever, and inspired a person to respond to God's grace. And there's more to come. How has God acted for you? How will you respond? Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.